There were 41 people in the conference room and 40 envelopes on the table. The department had just landed a $12 million contract, the biggest deal in company history, and the manager was walking the room handing out bonus envelopes like a game show host, shaking hands, soaking up applause. One by one, 40 names were called. Interns who had fetched coffee got envelopes. A guy who had been on vacation for half the project got an envelope. And the woman who had built the entire thing. Every model, every number, every line of the proposal that closed the deal sat in the back row and watched her name never come. When she quietly asked why, the manager smiled in front of everyone and said, "Bonuses are for people who contribute." And the room laughed. Here's what nobody in that room knew. Sitting at the head of the table was the company chairman, a 68-year-old man worth $2 billion who had personally, secretly recruited that woman 11 months earlier. He knew exactly what she'd built. He watched her get erased. And he said absolutely nothing. He couldn't. Because of a bet you're not going to believe, a bet in which that woman, without knowing it, was the stake on the table. Stay with me, because when this thing detonates, it takes down more than one man. 11 months before the envelopes, Nora Bennett was teaching a night class at a community college in Ohio, and she liked it that way. You have to understand who Nora used to be, because the industry certainly remembered. 10 years earlier, she'd been one of the most feared systems architects in enterprise software. The person giant companies flew in when a $200 million project was on fire and everyone else had given up. She didn't do interviews and she didn't do conferences. She did work. There are executives at 3 Fortune 500 companies who still refer to certain disasters by the phrase before Bennett and after Bennett. Then, at 33, she co-founded a startup, built its core technology almost single-handedly, and got forced out 18 months before the acquisition by partners with better lawyers and worse consciences. She watched men she'd carried stand on a stage and thank each other. Her name appeared in the press release exactly 0 times, so she left. Not dramatically, quietly, the way she did everything. She moved back to Ohio, taught database design to nurses and mechanics changing careers, and told herself she was done proving things to buildings full of people who counted credit instead of contribution. She'd been telling herself that for 6 years when the old man showed up in the back row of her Tuesday class. He sat through the entire 2-hour lecture. Gray suit, no laptop, taking notes with a fountain pen like it was 1974. Afterward, he introduced himself as Edward Grant, and Nora needed a second, because Edward Grant was the founder and chairman of Meridian Group, a firm with 9,000 employees, and men like that do not appear in community college classrooms in Ohio. He bought her a terrible vending machine coffee and made her an offer she would spend the next year trying to fully understand. He wanted her to come work at Meridian, not as an executive, not as a consultant with a corner office, as a mid-level analyst, 3rd floor, standard salary on paper, with the difference wired quietly from his personal holdings. No one would know he'd recruited her. No one would know her history, and her resume would be scrubbed down to something ordinary. She would enter that building with no armor, no title, and no protection, and just do the work. Naturally, she asked the only question that mattered. Why? And Edward Grant looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and said, "I built that company 40 years ago on one belief, that good work speaks for itself. Lately, I lie awake wondering if that's still true, or if I've built 9 floors of machinery for grinding up people exactly like you." I want to find out. I can't find out from the top because from the top, everyone lies to me. I need eyes at the bottom, and I need them to be the best eyes money can buy. It was a strange pitch. It was also, and Nora would only understand this much later, about 40% of the truth. Because Edward Grant had not come up with this experiment alone, in the dark, out of philosophical insomnia. There had been an argument, months earlier, on the top floor of that building between the two most powerful men in the company. There had been raised voices, and a challenge, and a handshake. What walked into her classroom that night looked like an old man's crisis of faith. It was actually the opening move of a wager. But she didn't know that. All she knew was that some stubborn, buried part of her, the part that had been quietly bleeding since a press release 6 years ago, wanted the answer to his question almost as badly as he did. She said yes. She gave the college her notice, packed 2 suitcases, and on a cold Monday in January, Nora Bennett walked into Meridian Group as employee number 8,347, an unremarkable new analyst on the 3rd floor. Her new manager's name was Greg Foley. He looked at her scrubbed, ordinary resume for about 9 seconds, assigned her to formatting slide decks, and forgot she existed. That would turn out to be the most expensive 9 seconds of his life. Let me tell you about Greg Foley, because every building has one. And knowing how they operate is half the reason I'm telling this story. Greg was 44, head of the Enterprise Solutions Department, and he had not produced an original piece of work in 9 years. What Greg produced was the appearance of work. He was a genius at it, genuinely, the way some people are geniuses at piano. He forwarded other people's emails with the words "great progress, team," and absorbed the credit like a sponge. He scheduled meetings about meetings. He had a gift for standing near success and a sixth sense for stepping away from failure about 2 weeks before it landed. Upper management thought Greg was a rock. His department knew exactly what Greg was and had learned, through years of watched examples, that saying so out loud was a career decision. Into this ecosystem walked Nora, and for 2 months, she did exactly what Edward Grant had asked. She watched. She formatted Greg's slide decks, and while formatting them, she read them. And what she read quietly horrified her. The department's flagship proposal, the one meant to win a $12 million infrastructure contract from a company called Helix Systems, was a beautiful corpse. Gorgeous slides wrapped around an architecture that would collapse within 18 months of deployment. She could see the failure from her desk, the way a structural engineer sees a crack in a dam. And here's where Nora made the decision that set everything in motion. She could have stayed invisible. That was technically the job. Instead, one evening in March, she stayed late and rewrote the technical core of the proposal, not a memo suggesting changes. The actual thing. 90 pages, a complete redesign, the kind of document maybe 30 people alive could produce. And she left it on Greg's desk with a 2-line note. Found some issues with the current approach. Alternative attached. Greg read 10 pages, understood 4 of them, and understood one thing with total clarity, which was that this was better than anything his department had ever produced. So he did what Greg did. He deleted her note, replaced the cover page, and presented the redesign to the executive committee the following week as the product of my team's new direction under my supervision. The committee was stunned. Word traveled upstairs, and on the 9th floor, Chairman Edward Grant read the new proposal. recognized within 5 pages exactly whose hands had built it, and smiled at his window for a long time. Then he did nothing. Remember that he did nothing, and keep asking yourself why, because the answer is coming and it changes everything. Helix Systems, the $12 million client, requested a technical session before signing. This was the moment Greg's whole system usually protected him from: direct contact between his borrowed brilliance and people qualified to question it. So, Greg brought a technical support team to sit behind him, and buried in that team, because someone had to be able to answer the hard questions, was the quiet analyst who'd written the thing. The session lasted 3 hours. Greg performed the first 20 minutes on charm, and then Helix's engineers got to the real questions: the load architecture, the failure cascades, the migration sequencing, and Greg began redirecting. Let me have my analyst speak to the details, and Nora spoke to the details. For 2.5 hours, she took apart every question they had, rebuilt it, and handed it back. Improved. No slides, drawing on a whiteboard. At one point, catching an error in Helix's own internal assumptions that their team had missed for a year. Engineers know when they're in a room with the real thing. By the end, Helix's people weren't asking Greg anything at all. They had physically angled their chairs toward the back of the room. 2 weeks later, Helix signed. $12 million, the largest contract in Meridian's history. And what nobody at Meridian knew, not Greg, not the executive committee, not even Nora herself, was that the deal had very nearly died in Helix's boardroom the week before. Their CEO, a formidable woman named Diane Okafor, had been unconvinced by Meridian's track record, and it was her own chief engineer who turned her around with one argument. He'd been in that 3-hour session, and he'd spent the drive home making phone calls, and he told Diane, "I don't care about their track record. I know who's actually building this. I'd bet my job on those hands." Diane Okafor trusted her chief engineer. She signed. But she was also a careful woman who had been burned before, so she had her lawyers add a quiet clause to the services agreement, a key personnel provision, standard in high-stakes contracts, naming the specific technical lead whose continued involvement the entire deal was contingent on. The clause sat there in Section 14, in 11-point font, like a landmine with a name on it. The name was not Greg Foley's. Back at Meridian, the victory lap began, and it was all Greg's. The all-hands celebration, the internal newsletter with his photo, the executive committee commendation. Nora watched it with something between disgust and grim fascination, because it was her old wound, the press release from 6 years ago, replaying at higher resolution. Still, she told herself the work mattered, and the work was hers, and the people who needed to know knew. She was half right, and then came the bonus meeting, the one from the beginning of this story: 41 people, 40 envelopes, and Greg's little joke: bonuses are for people who contribute, and the laughter, with Chairman Edward Grant sitting at the head of the table for the ceremonial handshake, watching the woman he had personally recruited get erased in front of his eyes. Nora looked directly at Grant in that moment. One look, across the room, the only two people alive who knew the truth. And the chairman of Meridian Group held her eyes for 2 full seconds, and then looked down at his agenda and moved to the next item. Something in Nora went very cold and very quiet. She had been ground up by machinery before, but this was new. This time, the machine had recruited her, promised her the truth mattered, and then sat at the head of the table filing its nails. That night, she typed her resignation letter and left it unsigned on her kitchen counter and told herself she'd sign it in the morning. She never got the chance. Because at 7:40 the next morning, her personal phone rang, a number she hadn't seen in 6 years. And the voice on the other end said, "Nora, it's Diane Okafor from Helix. We need to talk before Friday's signing, and I'd prefer your manager didn't know about this call." That Friday was the Phase 2 signing ceremony, and Meridian treated it like a coronation. Ninth floor boardroom, catering, a photographer, the executive committee in their best suits. Phase 2 expanded the Helix contract from $12 million to $30, and Greg Foley had spent the week rehearsing his remarks in his office with the door closed. Chairman Grant was there. So was Alan Pierce, Meridian's chief executive, a silver-haired operator who had run the company's day-to-day for 15 years. And if you watched carefully that morning, you'd have noticed something odd, which is that Pierce and Grant, the two most powerful men in the building, did not say one word to each other, like two chess players in the final minutes of a clock. Diane Okafor arrived with her chief engineer and her general counsel, which should have been the first warning. "You don't bring your top lawyer to a party," Greg opened with his remarks. "The journey, the vision, my team's tireless efforts." And Diane Okafor listened with her hands folded, letting him finish completely, which was the second warning. Then she said, "Before we sign, I have one item. It's about Section 14, the key personnel clause." Greg smiled the smile of a man who had never read Section 14, and Diane continued, "Our expansion is contingent on the continued leadership of the specific technical architect this contract names. We've heard some concerning things about how your organization allocates recognition. So, before I put $30 million on this table, I'd like that person to walk me through the Phase 2 architecture, right now, in this room." "Of course," said Greg, and gestured to himself. "Ask me anything." What followed was 90 seconds that people who were in that room still describe in hushed tones. Diane's chief engineer asked one question. One, a precise technical load boundary question about the system's failure behavior, the kind of question the actual architect could answer in her sleep, because she had designed the answer. Greg began to talk. He deployed every tool in his arsenal, the confident preamble, the redirect, the holistic view, the let me contextualize, and the engineer just waited. And the silence underneath Greg's words grew teeth, and everyone in that room, the committee, the photographer, the caterers at the back, slowly understood that they were watching a man drown in a suit. Finally, Diane Okafor raised one hand, ending it, and said, "Perhaps I can help." She opened her folder and read a single name aloud, the name in Section 14. The technical lead her chief engineer had identified after that 3-hour session, the person her lawyers had quietly confirmed through the working session attendance records, Nora Bennett. She looked around the boardroom and said, "I don't see her here. Why is the person my $30 million depends on not in this room?" And into that silence, for the first time in 11 months, Chairman Edward Grant spoke. He said, "She's 4 floors down, formatting slides." Then he turned, not to Diane, but to Alan Pierce, his own chief executive, and said 5 words in a voice like a door closing. "Alan, I win. Pay up." The room did not understand. So Grant stood up and made them understand. And this is the part Nora herself only heard about secondhand because she was, in fact, 4 floors down. A year earlier, Grant told the room, he and Pierce had fought bitterly about the state of the company. Grant said the culture was rotten, that Meridian had become a machine where parasites in the middle harvested everything talent produced, and that it would eventually kill the firm. Pierce called that founder's nostalgia and insisted the company was a meritocracy. Cream rises, the system works. And so, two proud old men, they had settled it the way proud old men do. A wager, with real stakes, board seats, and Grant's reform mandate riding on it. Formalized by their personal attorneys, Grant would place one genuinely world-class talent at the bottom of the organization. Anonymous, unprotected. 1 year. If the system recognized her and raised her up, Pierce won and Grant would retire quietly and stop meddling. If the system buried her, stole from her, erased her, Grant won control to tear the middle layer down. Both men bound by one iron rule that made the whole thing mean anything. No interference, not a word, not a favor, not a raised eyebrow. Grant had watched Greg steal her work with his own eyes, watched the envelope ceremony, watched her look at him across that table, and had been contractually obligated to look away. And he confessed in front of the entire boardroom that it was the hardest thing he had done in 40 years of business. Greg Foley at this point had the complexion of hotel oatmeal, but this story doesn't end with him because he was never the final boss. He was a symptom. Someone was sent to fetch Nora. And here is where every version of this story you've ever heard goes one way and Nora Bennett went another. Because she walked into that boardroom, took in the scene, the pale manager, the triumphant chairman, the stone-faced CEO, the $30 million client, and Diane Okafor said warmly, "There she is." And Grant began with actual emotion. "Nora, I want to tell you what all this was." And Nora said quietly, "I already put it together in the elevator." And then she turned to the two most powerful men in that building and refused to say thank you. She said, "You want me to be the happy ending of your experiment, but let's be precise about what happened here. One of you built a machine that eats people like me. The other one knew it was eating me, week after week, and stayed silent to win an argument." She looked at Grant. "You didn't recruit an analyst. You bought a stake for a bet. 11 months of my work, my erasure, that little ceremony with the envelopes, all of it was your wager playing out. And the fact that you bet on the truth doesn't change the fact that I was the chip." Then she looked at Pierce. "And you should pray the board never finds out how right he was. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet." Diane Okafor, $30 million client, sat back in her chair with the expression of a woman getting far more than she'd paid for. And into the silence, Nora put a folder on the table because, of course, she had a folder. She'd had it since 7:40 the previous morning, and said, "So here's how this actually ends." The folder contained 3 things. The first was her resignation from the 3rd floor, effective immediately because Nora Bennett was never going to format another slide. The second was a proposal, drafted overnight with a lawyer of her own, for a new independent division reporting directly to the board, not to Grant personally, with full authority over technical standards and, this was the clause she refused to soften, a binding attribution and compensation policy for the entire company, so that credit at Meridian would live in documented contribution records, instead of in whoever spoke loudest at the celebration. The third was a signed letter from Diane Okafor, arranged during that secret Friday call, confirming that Helix's 30 million and the 60 million behind it in future phases would follow Nora's leadership and only Nora's leadership wherever it sat. She had walked into the boardroom with more leverage than anyone at the table, and she had built it in 36 hours, quietly, the way she did everything. They took the deal. Of course, they took the deal. Grant took it with something like pride, Pierce took it with something like relief, and the board, when the dust settled, took it with the specific enthusiasm of people who had just watched $30 million nearly walk out of a signing ceremony. Greg Foley did not survive the month, and I'd love to tell you he was fired in some cinematic thunderclap, but the truth is more fitting. The new attribution system simply made him visible. Every project, every contribution, logged and named. Within weeks, the machinery of appearances he'd spent 9 years building stopped working because appearances were no longer the currency. And Greg, stripped of other people's output, was revealed to produce approximately nothing. He resigned ahead of his performance review, and last anyone heard was at another firm, forwarding emails. Great progress? Game. Some men are not defeated. They are only relocated. The 40 envelopes, by the way, were reissued. 41 this time, recalculated by documented contribution. Nora's was the largest by a factor that made the finance department triple-check the math, and she donated every dollar of it to the community college in Ohio, to a scholarship fund for career changers, in the name of her Tuesday night class. So, what do you carry out of this story? 3 things, and I've thought hard about each one. First, for anyone doing brilliant work in a building where Greg is harvesting it, document as you go. Not out of paranoia, out of arithmetic. Nora survived erasure because the work itself was unfakeable, the working session records existed, and the client's engineers knew what they'd seen. Credit thieves operate in fog. Records are sunlight. Send the email that timestamps your idea. Keep the drafts. The day it matters, it will be the only thing that matters. Second, real recognition rarely comes from the stage. It comes sideways, from the people qualified to judge the work, the client's chief engineer making phone calls on a drive home, the peer who knows exactly how hard the thing you did was. Stages can be stolen. Rooms full of experts cannot. Build your reputation with the people who can actually read the blueprints, and it becomes the one asset no manager can forward with his name on it. And third, the one that costs the most. When the powerful finally decide to reward you, check whether you were their partner or their proof. Nora's vindication was real, but it arrived as the outcome of 2 rich men's argument. And she was the only person in that boardroom who refused to let gratitude blur that line. You can accept the win and still name the game. In fact, you must, because the difference between being valued and being useful is a difference nobody will ever point out to you. You have to see it yourself, say it out loud, and set your price accordingly. Nora did. That, more than the folder, more than the 30 million, is why she ended that story owning the room. If this one hit home, and I suspect for a lot of you it did, hit the like button because it tells me to make more stories like this. Subscribe and ring the bell because next week, I'm telling the story of a hotel maid who spent 3 years cleaning the penthouse of a billionaire until the day his will was read and every lawyer in the room went silent. And I need to hear from you in the comments on this one because I genuinely can't decide. Was Edward Grant right to stay silent for the bet, Since winning it fixed the whole company? Or was watching her suffer for a year unforgivable no matter what it bought? The answer says a lot about you either way, and I read every single comment. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.